Welcome to a special edition of Legal AF. Donald Trump, as we know, has been using false claims of emergencies in America, emergency powers that he needs to have, national security crises, because that's a way for him to try to blow through the separation of powers and aggrandize even more power, as we're watching really the only presidency in modern history that at least publicly, with Nixon, it was behind the scenes, but publicly, we're just lurching from one abuse of power to the next. And what we want to do here on Legal AF is bring in experts to brief our audience about these issues. I mean, as I like to joke, with my 35 years of trial experience, I can bring people to the courthouse and even to the front door of the courtroom. But for the people that are in the courtroom or advising the people in the courtroom who are on the front lines, the first responders for our democracy in the courtrooms, we got to bring in the experts. And I'm so pleased today to have Hina Shamsi, who is the director of the National Security Project at the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU. And everybody knows who follows Legal AF, how it warms the cockles of my heart to talk about the ACLU and the work that they're doing in the trenches. I mean, we talk about the attorneys general and the 50 cases they filed. We've talked about the public interest groups like Democracy Forward and the ones that they filed. But the American Civil Liberties Union, both in the first term and in the second term of Trump, are really leading the charge. So I want to bring in Hina Shamsi. Hina, welcome to Legal AF.
It's my pleasure to be with you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, we were joking before we started recording that, to give our audience more confidence and make them sleep better at night after the election and before the inauguration, I was downloading the ACLU briefing book about every major issue from reproductive rights, women's rights, immigration rights. And boy, did you guys get it right in your brief about what was going to happen with this administration, to give my audience confidence about how groups like the ACLU on the front lines were prepared for the Trump administration. And now some people might have thought, wait, the ACLU has a national security unit within it to talk about everything from constitutional compliance of presidential policy to human rights to civil rights. Why? Well, now we see why. We see a president who's using the mantle, the fake mantle of national security threats to try to cram down I'll call it his unconstitutional abuse of power. So why don't you bring our audience up to speed? What keeps you up at night, and what is your project and the ACLU doing about it?
Well, I have to say that there is a long list of things that keeps me up at night. One of them that we started working on, and I really appreciate you shouting out our briefing papers before, because we did spend a lot of time just thinking through what has he urged before, what are the kinds of national security issues that have come up since my project was founded in about 2004, because presidential abuse of power isn't new in our democracy, but we were worried, particularly after his first administration and the things that we saw there, that it would become that much more extreme. And one of the things that we were most concerned about is the abusive use of the military on domestic soil, and the ways in which federal civilian law enforcement and intelligence agencies could be further turned inward against our own population. And those are the things that I think are really coming into play. These are the things that we started preparing for, I want to say about a year ago, particularly with respect to the deployment of the military. And we saw that come into play with California and now with DC. And I think that the use or invocation of national security or emergency powers is being used by this president as essentially a blank check to bypass laws and checks and balances in ways that are harmful to our people, as well as the communities and institutions that are involved.
Was his attempted use of the military and using the Joint Chiefs and all with the protests that were at the White House in his first term, where there was reporting that he was even saying shoot them, and then using the military or trying to use the military? Was that your first inkling that this was a president who saw the military as a weapon he could use to enforce his policy and against the American people?
That was certainly the first concrete inkling, but I just remind our listeners that these are the use of the military, something that he'd been threatening in campaign speeches for far longer than that, and that escalated. And so, you had different permutations. He was talking about it, I mean, to the extent that you could try and impose logic upon what was being said. The strands were to abuse that power to suppress protest, and then potentially for immigration purposes, which we are seeing play out now in a variety of different ways. And then the move that he made recently in DC was to go from what it was in California, for example, where the excuse was emergency and need to bring in the Marines and federalize the California National Guard because dissent was being seen as a form of rebellion that justified this extreme measure. And DC, the move has been now to crime. Baseless claims of crime rates that are absolutely not what he says that they are, to justify something that is really a breathtakingly dangerous power grab that, you ask what keeps me up at night, widespread violations of our civil rights and civil liberties.
Yeah, and that's going to make our audience feel better that somebody like you is up at night about these issues. On the and then you read, just to stay in DC for a minute, then you read Bondi's new directive. It has nothing to do with violent crime and why Big Balls was jumped by a bunch of 15-year-olds. It's about homeless encampments and immigration policy. And I'm like, well, that's what they're doing? I thought there was a crime wave. I didn't realize there was an immigration crime wave going on in DC. So what he says out loud and what he says in court or in his or in filings are often, am I right, two different things.
Well, it's sort of I was listening to his speech when he was announcing this, and it was like, again, why are you doing this? It's everything to show off to Putin, to crime, to immigration, to whatever else.
The 3-day trial in front of Judge Breyer starting that day on the Posse Comitatus Act.
Yeah. So, if we break it down and we look at what was actually happening and claimed in DC, the president has, as you know, certain unique authorities given DC's unique status, which is why our affiliate and others have been calling for statehood. DC does not have the protections of federalism that states do. So he invoked Section 740 of the Home Rule Act to take over the police department. There was a lawsuit challenging that from the Attorney General. And so that's been pulled back a bit. But you're exactly right that Pam Bondi has directed the Metropolitan Police Department to assist in the enforcement of immigration law in any way deemed necessary by the federal government, notwithstanding that DC had sanctuary laws which limit information sharing and collaboration between local police and federal immigration agents.
Yeah. And so let's turn, that's a good pivot point. Let's turn to Donald Trump claiming everything's an emergency, everything's a national security threat to justify things that aren't even remotely connected, no connective tissue between, I wrote down some policies about FEMA and national security, immigration, veterans affairs. Paul Blumenthal, who's a friend of Legal AF, just did I'm sure you caught it, a great article in HuffPo about this the crying of national security as a way to try to get obedience from judges, or at least judicial deference. And I think they I want to get your opinion, of course. I think they were buoyed in the White House because, in a couple of these orders on the shadow docket, the Supreme Court said, well, you're getting into the area of national security. Oh, that seems to be, you got to be careful. Got to be careful, Judge Zinnes. And Abrego Garcia, you're treading into this. Be careful. And then, of course, Stephen Miller and the rest of the people in the White House were like, yes, we just call everything national security. What's your take on all of that?
I mean, my take is that this is at the heart of not only so many of the lawsuits that we have filed in order to protect people's rights, ranging from our lawsuits challenging the invocation of the Alien Enemies Act to a variety of other policies, but it is a attempt by the administration to steamroll fundamental rights, right? Whether you're talking about, again, LA, and thank goodness for California's lawsuit there, which, if you'll recall, started out because there were immigration raids in California and people were protesting cruelty of their neighbors being snatched up. And so it was a claim of national security and emergency power in that instance to suppress protest, right? So that's one example. We've got due process, we've got protest, we've got concerns about, Fourth Amendment search and seizure and checkpoints in DC and how they're going to be complied with. And so in one sense, going back to where you started out, what they're trying to do is say national security flag, emergency flag, which traditionally has meant that the courts would give deference. Courts give deference, for example, too much deference, as many of our lawsuits have argued, in the field of national security or foreign affairs. And the question becomes, do you give legal deference as well as factual deference, right? What is the scope of review that we apply? And so those are some of the tussles that are going on in court right now that are hugely, hugely consequential in California, for example. And it's really astounding to read the filings of the federal government in California.
Talk about that. What's eye-popping for you, for our audience?
Well, so among the things that are eye-popping are issues that are going to have gone up to the Ninth Circuit at this point, which is the government is saying that the president essentially has authority that judges have to defer to. When he says emergency, judges have to step back.
That's it. It's over.
Right. And so what we're talking about is pitting of political theater and blatantly phony justifications for abuse of national security and emergency powers against our rights to protest, against our right to equal treatment, against our rights to freedom from, all of the Fourth Amendment guarantees. And so these are the things that are playing out now. But if I can, just one more thing, Mike.
Of course.
Which is, I really want people to take away also that even as he is doing this, and even as we had Marines and Federalized National Guard in California, or 18 federal agencies, civilian agencies with alphabet soup acronyms, or National Guard from DC to 5 other states that, as we are sitting here today, have said that they're going to be supporting the president by providing more National Guard. It does not matter what uniform they wear. They are all bound by the Constitution, and they are all bound by the Bill of Rights. And I'd love to talk, if this is an area that you want to get into, about how the administration is trying to muddy the water where the military is concerned.
Yeah, let's do that. I think our audience would really like it. Before we get to that, for those that are just joining, I have Hina Shamsi on. She's the director of the National Security Project at the American Civil Liberties Union, who's out there at the forefront with, I don't even know, it's got to be hundreds of suits by now by the ACLU against the Trump administration, and winning. And it's important. I mean, the numbers, just some people get fatigued by this and, oh, we're losing at the Supreme Court. But these cases that have been filed are so important. I just saw a statistic that of not even talking about Bondi's directives, but of the 274 or so executive orders, 110 have been blocked. 90 are still in litigation and 74 are up and running. He's batting 27% on his executive orders. And that's all because of the work of groups like the American Civil Liberties Union to bring these lawsuits. Because we only talk about the losses at the Supreme Court. I'm not saying they're not monumental, because they're some of the most major constitutional issues that we are losing on. However, we are winning at a 90% rate in the courts, and that's where justice is done by and large. Very few cases get to the first level of appeal, and very few cases, if any, get to the United States Supreme Court. We got to win there, and he's folding. There's funds that are flying out because Donald Trump's not appealing, and he's caving in because these suits are filed in the shadow of these lawsuits. Let's turn to your issue that you wanted to brief our audience on now, Hina.
Which is what I think our listeners will hopefully intuitively understand, but it's worth saying that domestic deployment of the federal military or the federalized National Guard or National Guard like in DC is rare. Historically in this country, it's been reserved for really genuine emergencies, like the extreme situation, for example, of an actual war or an armed rebellion, or to enforce federal laws if civilian agencies and courts aren't functioning. The president is threatening this as a norm. He's carried it out in California. He's working on carrying it out in DC. And he's threatening, whether it's for immigration or now for crime, to carry it out in other cities. And I will say that they tend to be large urban blue cities with large communities of color and immigrants and populations that refuse to bend the knee. And the ways, however, in which he's trying to circumvent what I think are such really critically important parts of a democratic value and norm in this country is what troubles me incredibly at this point. So, one absolute foundational norm in this country is that the military should not be policing civilians, and the expression of that norm is a law called the Posse Comitatus Act that folks will have heard about. And what that prohibits is that troops under federal authority are prohibited under criminal penalty from directly enforcing civil law against civilians. So break it down to policing civilians. Now, in California, the feds claimed that they weren't in violation of the Posse Comitatus Act because troops weren't, in essence, putting their hands on civilians. But part of the trial that has been going on in California and was going on last week had testimony come out about the National Guard, federalized National Guard, Marines, accompanying civilian agencies on immigration raids, securing perimeters, doing things that law enforcement agencies do, not what we think of the military doing. And in all of these ways, the military, whether it's in California or DC or wherever else, they are trained for their own important purposes. They are not normally trained for municipal policing, right, de-escalation techniques, or or the kinds of things that we seek to hold state and local law enforcement accountable to, right? And so what worries me, what should worry us all, is obviously the harm to the communities that might result, but also the legal and ethical jeopardy that troops are being exposed to. And I don't fault National Guard troops here. They're being pulled from their own communities where they already have regular jobs or other important jobs, often focused on emergency relief, and they are being placed into situations where things are very uncertain and very out of control. For example, in DC right now, we do not know, is there one combined command, right? And is it coherent? Who do the troops listen to? What are the rules for the use of force? There are absolutely rules for DC National Guard's use of force, but are they the same for the close to or approximately 1,000 other troops coming in from other parts of the country, some of whom have never been to DC before? What kind of training would they be getting? And what are the laws that they think they should be abiding by? You are putting people in jeopardy. And you're doing it unnecessarily. You're doing it as an abuse of national security and emergency powers. And the concern is that he's going to try and do it elsewhere as well.
Yeah, and wait till we see what happens when the ACLU or other groups bring their first military brutality case, right? We often see police brutality cases, 1984 type cases, different type of civil rights cases where civil rights are being abused by law enforcement. What if that law enforcement is the federalized National Guard, who, as you just said, are not trained? That's a very good point. It's really been missed by most of the commentators. I'm so glad you brought it up. That's how we hold our law enforcement ultimately accountable if it rises to the level of a civil rights abuse. But what do you do when the Marine who doesn't know what he's doing when it comes, because he's used to doing something, as you said, he's used to doing something else as a Marine. Okay. They're storming a beach. They're taking a building. They're leaving, they're fighting their way out of a firefight. They're not, what is effectively a civil protest that Donald Trump has converted by fit of alchemy into a rebellion. And now they've got the troops to handle that. I mean, Judge Breyer, who's ably handling this case, the Posse Comitatus case that you just described, I mean, in his own writing that was ultimately not affirmed by the Ninth Circuit, he said effectively, his quote, I'm paraphrasing, throwing a mango, throwing a brick, throwing a cup of water is not a rebellion. And the problem is when it got to the Ninth Circuit, which was dominated by a Trump appointee, I thought was a moderate, but turned out not to be so much, in I think it was a Bush appointee and a new Biden appointee. They went back to that deference thing that we just started this video about, which was who are we to differ with a president declaring a rebellion? Well, that's your job. And we saw it very early on, of course, with the Alien Enemies Act, as they tried to do a steamroll, as you put it, of the federal judiciary, who some were prepared and some weren't. But you see, as you said, the struggle going on in the courts, led by your organization with the federal judges, about, are you going to give robust oversight on this? Or are you going to give judicial? Are you going to give preference or deference on that, or obedience on national security? Sort of, which is it? You heard. I mean, it's. I think it's properly memorialized by Judge Breyer saying out loud at the last day of the trial, "What are the limits? Are you telling me?" Because the Trump administration's position in every one of these cases is, there are no limits, because you shouldn't even be reviewing any. There should be no judicial review whatsoever. I said war. I said predatory incursion. I said rebellion. Back up, back off. And the judges are like, what are you talking about? We have checks and balances in this system. You do your Article 2 thing, but I got an Article 3 thing I got to do. And Breyer's like, are you telling me there's no limits? I'm very concerned by your position, Department of Justice, that there are no limits on the use of the military on domestic soil. What did you make of that in that exchange?
Well, two thoughts on that. One is specific to the California case, which is that the Ninth Circuit is going to have another shot at this, right? Like the Ninth Circuit's original ruling was in the context of an emergency application and to stay Judge Breyer's original order. And so they gave some deference on, but not all, right? Like they actually rejected the government's most extreme, the Fed's most extreme argument, which is give its entire deference. And they said, we get to interpret the law, right? But then they overly deferred on the facts. And so that brings in the facts. We seem to have new categories of dystopian hellscaping going on in our cities that are a surprise to the inhabitants of those cities. But I think and hope that with more time and with additional briefing and a recognition of the consequence of what they're doing and saying, one of the things that the Ninth Circuit has a chance to do is really think through that what you're talking about when you're talking about the deployment at that particular stage was in a First Amendment context on domestic soil. And when you're thinking about that, courts recognize that First Amendment values have to come into play, that part of the reason that the founders distrusted and created structures against domestic deployment of the military is because of the risks that immediately raises for people's civil liberties, individual freedoms. And then I think that is also going to have to play out in DC. And it is so worrying that governors are rushing to provide support and their own state National Guard units to essentially militarize the nation's capital.
Yeah, and to your point, to rush into sending more people into a civil rights, civil liberties, insecurity and violation. I mean, you said at the top of the video, or towards the middle of the video, you said that one of the things that concerns you the most, right? These people are not trained to do this, and there's going to be abuse of civil liberties as a result. Sending more people does not solve that problem. It makes it even worse. You know what I think our audience would love is to end the video with sort of them understanding what your day-to-day is like. What, as the director of the National Security Project for the American Civil Liberties Union, and I'm an old lawyer, so I see your conference table in the back, and I'm sure there's a brief or something back there that you're marking up. But tell our audience what you do to support maybe you're in court. Tell our audience what you do as the director of that unit and how you support the cases that the ACLU is bringing. I have the incredible good fortune of working with brilliant, smart, dedicated colleagues, both on my own team and then across different parts of the legal organization. In this administration, a lot of our work has turned to very much of a domestic focus. So our range of issues covers this kind of thing that we're looking at and providing advice to our affiliates around the country, as well as our National Political Advocacy Department on laws, policies, people's Know Your Rights materials that we're going to be putting out. So it is a lot of legal and policy work that I get to do. And then our team looks out for abuses to challenge. We are pursuing national security and other abuse cases in a variety of different contexts. For example, our clients had a win in a First Amendment challenge to sanctions imposed on the ICC because they were preventing our human rights advocate clients from exercising their First Amendment rights
to provide information and research to the ICC about massive human rights violations by the Taliban in Afghanistan and the Rohingya genocide. So we do that. We're also deeply involved in the ADA cases, and a host of other cases and issues involving everything from challenges to watch listing, to religious questioning at the border, to challenges against state measures, often in Republican states, imposing restrictions on people of Asian American background to own land. So it is the gamut of things that are about national security violations where we think we can support our clients and the communities we work with in making a difference, in disrupting, in denying, and defending.
We are a better country. Our audience will sleep better at night knowing that Hina Shamsi is running the National Security Project at the American Civil Liberties Union. It's an organization that is near and dear to Midas Touch and to Legal AF. We follow your work. We report on it. But to bring somebody like you here to brief our audience is just a special pleasure. And I'm telling you, people will have much more confidence knowing that you're in the foxhole fighting the good fight, or as I like to say, you're a first responder running into the burning building to save democracy. And we need more people like you. I'd love to have you back on the show in the future. You
are very kind, and thank you.
All right. Michael Popok, Legal AF, joined by Hina Shamsi here on the Legal AF YouTube channel. Can't get your fill of Legal AF? Me neither. That's why we formed the Legal AF Substack. Every time we mention something in a hot take, whether it's a court filing or a oral argument, come over to the Substack. You'll find the court filing and the oral argument there, including a daily roundup that I do called, wait for it, Morning AF. What else? All the other contributors from Legal AF are there as well. We got some new reporting. We got interviews. We got ad-free versions of the podcast and hot takes. Where? Legal AF on Substack. Come over now to free subscribe.